So I'll admit I'm kind of a third-degree anime fan, by which I mean I appreciate Japanese animation on many levels, but I'm neither a hardcore otaku or professional critic of that scene. I'm just a person who occasionally looks at what's interesting and or popular, and might watch 1 or 2 series a year, often long after they come out. Guess when I finally got around to watching Death Note? March of this year. So yeah, I'm not going to be getting a job on Anime News Network writing articles alongside Jacob Chapman anytime soon. Yu Yu Hakusho was never really on my radar, despite it being kind of a big deal. Let's break down the rap sheet. Yu Yu Hakusho! Created, written, and drawn by Yoshihiro Togashi. The original manga ran for 175 issues for Weekly Shōnen Jump between December 1990 and July 1994. It was wildly popular, selling over 50 million copies and winning the Shogakukan Manga Award for Best Shōnen Series in 1993. Perhaps the greatest award any manga can win. Its anime adaptation ran for 112 episodes between October 1992 and December 1994, where it got fantastic ratings, at one point hitting 24.7, meaning there was a time when a quarter of Japanese households with televisions tuned in for Yu Yu Hakusho. You need to be something like Dragon Ball Z to get higher numbers than that. Japanese anime magazine Animage awarded the show the Anime Grand Prix in 1994 and 1995, and it won second place in 1993, losing to Sailor Moon. Animage ranked it at number 53 on their top 100 anime listing in 2001. A web poll in 2006 ranked it as the 15th best anime of all time. Japanese men's magazine Brutus voted it the 6th best of all time. It spawned 2 theatrical films, over 20 video games, and a trading card game. When it hit the United States, first under Adult Swim and then later Toonami, it started off with pretty good ratings and pretty good reviews, though both of those seemed to drop off with later episodes of the series. Regardless, something this popular and with this much acclaim, even if it's mostly Japanese acclaim, passed me by completely. As a filthy casual, I credit this to the fact that it wasn't as popular as the really popular stuff, getting edged out by cornerstone shows like Dragon Ball or Sailor Moon or Pokemon, and being just slightly less critically loved than the really good stuff like Cowboy Bebop or Trigun or Full Metal Alchemist. When you're like me and only allow yourself a limited time to watch anime, you tend to look towards the A+ material, and even something as high as the A- material can slip you by pretty easily. That is until someone literally pays you money to watch it. I have the best job in the world, guys. So we're going to be talking about Yu Yu Hakusho, but rather than do the usual thing where I simply recap the plot with some added jokes, I really want to get under the hood on this one, get knee-deep into the show's structure and style to see what makes it tick. So let's talk about framing. That's a word with 1,001 uses, but we'll narrow it down to 2: visual framing and psychological framing. Visual framing concerns a work's cinematography. It's the placement of objects and their relation to each other in a scene, the composition of a shot. In the few episodes of Yu Yu Hakusho that I've seen, there's a lot of really flashy shot composition, but that's okay. It's often better to be utilitarian, and you can still imply things subtly through simple visual framing. Let's consider this short scene. Our main character is Yusuke, a young, disrespectful punk, and he's just been kicked out of school by one of his teachers. We start with this shot here, and it's a pretty apt example of how visual framing draws your eye to a subject. You have the subject of the scene dead center in the shot, so he's standing roughly where your eye line would naturally be, but virtually everything else in this shot is meant to guide your eyes towards him. Look at how many straight lines there are in this shot. There's a ton of them, and they all converge inwards. Our brain naturally wants to follow lines, so many people in visual arts utilize what is called leading lines to direct your eyes to what they want to show you. Now, not every line here points to Yusuke, but those that don't point to other lines that do, so no matter where your eye starts when this shot begins, it'll eventually get to the shot's focal point by following these lines, in this case Yusuke. We also have a series of rectangles nestled into each other that all frame Yusuke within them. Then we have color. Yusuke in his uniform is the darkest element in this shot, except maybe for this sign on the left side that's kind of nestled away. All the other colors are extremely light. You have blues, light greens, beiges, and grays, and a very light shade to contrast with the dark green shape of Yusuke. And of course there's motion, namely Yusuke is the only thing that's moving, which draws your eyes to where he is. There isn't anybody else walking on the sidewalk, no cars driving by, and no wind making the leaves on those trees move. When you lay it all out like that, it might sound like overkill, but most people won't ever be consciously aware of what this composition is actually doing. It's all subconscious stuff for the sake of clarity. And clarity is probably one of the most important things in visual storytelling. And it's not like the visual framing in the shot is just see the guy in the center of the scene. It's actually telling us something. First, the shot is a direct mirror of one earlier establishing the school. In fact, I think it's using the exact same background, only that shot is full of people, laughing students enjoying each other's company. Mirror it with this shot, and that shows us how much of a loner Yusuke has made himself, further emphasized in his character design. The school dress code is blue, and Yusuke wears green to spite it. The character is not only isolated from the rest of his classmates. By showing him this small and far away from the camera, he's isolated from the audience as well. It evokes a feeling of loneliness, which betrays the character's tough, I don't care exterior. In context, this scene is a flashback of events from Yusuke's point of view, so the framing of this scene is dictated, at least in theory, by the character's subjective feelings in this scene. And its setup. This shot leads us to believe that Yusuke is alone when this happens. This is Principal Takanaka, and not exactly the smallest guy in the world. Looking back at that shot, there's really no place he could have come from without being seen by either the audience or Yusuke. This is a pretty common thing in this first episode, characters entering or leaving the scene without being noticed. So now we have a second character, an authority figure no less, one who just gained a physical edge over Yusuke with his off-screen punch. This character is naturally taller than Yusuke, but the visual framing emphasizes Takanaka's dominance in this scene by showing us angles that emphasize this size difference. We have a shot looking up at Takanaka with very dramatic lighting that's actually impossible at this moment since there's nothing to cast that shadow. Here we have Yusuke off-center and taking up a very small portion of the screen, while Takanaka takes up a third of the entire space. But then we have a switch. Takanaka grabs Yusuke by the ear, but it turns out to be a fake. Again, we have an off-screen gag, this time at Takanaka's expense, so now Yusuke is the dominant character. The angle switches from low to high, making Takanaka seem a lot smaller, while Yusuke is made larger, helped by the character climbing on top of this wall. Demonstrating dominance through visual framing is actually really important for a show with a lot of combat. When two characters are fighting, the one who is winning the fight is usually shown higher than his or her opponent, striking downwards. There's a lot of jumping around in Yu Yu Hakusho for this reason, and actually in a lot of action-oriented anime in general. This scene is very simple, but it's a pretty great example of how visual framing tells a story. If you cut all the dialogue and turned everything in the scene to flat shapes with no detail, you could still communicate this scene pretty effectively. Establishing shot leads to off-screen gag, leads to dominance, leads to off-screen gag, leads to switch in dominance. Again, most of this stuff is only noticeable if you're actually looking for it like I am here, but your brain still picks up on it. And if the visual framing is off, like if they framed Yusuke as dominant in a scene where he really shouldn't be, your brain will register this as wrong. Good visual framing is usually invisible until the storytellers are intentionally trying to disorient for artistic purposes, like characters panning across the screen at different speeds to emphasize a scene's turbulence. So now that we have a grasp on how Yu Yu Hakusho tells its story through visuals, let's consider how it tells it through its script. The first episode of Yu Yu Hakusho tells its story out of chronological order, starting off at the midpoint. Yusuke saves a young child who's walked out into the street. Yusuke gets hit by a car and dies. Now, considering this entire series is about the afterlife, that doesn't seem like a bad way to start things, and seeing Yusuke float around in a very confused ghost is a good hook as any. But why is this chronologically the midpoint, and why show the midpoint first? Interestingly enough, this first episode doesn't really do much to set up what this show is going to be about. It introduces some characters and the fact that it's a supernatural show about life after death, but it isn't really concerned with the actual story the show ends up telling. This first episode feels like it has a different agenda from the rest of the series, or at least the rest of the series I've seen. It's almost a little self-contained short film by itself, and shuffling up the order of events is the key to what it's trying to do. What's important is that the events that precede this accident are shown to us as Yusuke's flashbacks, and this is where psychological framing comes in. Framing concerns itself with the subjective perspectives of individuals or groups and how the same events can be perceived differently depending on who's perceiving them. From an objective standpoint, the events preceding the accident aren't all that interesting. Yusuke goes to school, where he meets a girl named Keiko, a childhood friend for some reason. He ditches, goes home to find his alcoholic mother still in bed, leaves, has a fight with another student named Kuwabara, whom he easily defeats, and then saves the kid, dying in the process. If you saw these events in that order, without that opening hook, it might leave you with the impression that this show is less supernatural action comedy and more a slice-of-life drama, so changing the chronology was a good way to ensure new viewers that this is not the case. But what I feel is more important about this is that by showing these events in flashback, it reframes the events as Yusuke's subjective experience. So let's go back to these interactions. First, you have Keiko, who is incredibly cross with Yusuke. As class representative, his poor attendance gives her a bad name. From Yusuke's point of view, she sounds very bossy and self-centered. It also doesn't help that their relationship seems to be built on sexual harassment.
You hear me?
Nice uniform. It's lacy.
Yeah, I know, different culture or whatever, but despite what this show tries to accomplish, there's no actual real-world reason these two should be friends. Moving on, we see Yusuke having confrontations with two different members of the school staff, one who wants to kick him out for his behavior, the other who wants to keep him in school for his behavior. Sending mixed signals there, guys. And the principal's sneaking up on people and punching them in the back of the head. That's not very nice. He then goes back home, where his mom pesters him about staying in school or getting a job, basically demanding a level of responsibility from him that she seems to lack, being a lazy alcoholic who stays up late, sleeps till the afternoon, and then watches television until it's time to drink again. Then there's the fight with Kuwabara. We don't know much about him at this point, but his attempted assault against Yusuke seemed to be a regular thing, and while he doesn't appear to pose much of a threat, there's only so many times you can get mugged on the street before you think people have it out for you. These are the people Yusuke surrounds himself with, people who hate him, who do not want him around, many of whom express this with physical assault. That's how he frames the world around him. It's for that reason that Yusuke isn't all that bummed about being dead. Who would miss him? That's when Botan shows up. Botan is a guide to the spirit world, a grim reaper of sorts who takes the recently deceased to the afterlife. She has blue hair and rides a flying boat, because, Japan. However, this is not a simple pickup and delivery, because Yusuke was not actually fated to die that day. The spirit world in Yu Yu Hakusho is many things, but for this first episode, what it represents is a certain level of objectivity. As a ghost, Yusuke can watch and hear the things going on around him, but he cannot physically interact with anything, cannot change the course of events. In this state, he is, in effect, a member of the audience watching the show along with us. And we know, from our objective framing as the audience, that Yusuke is kind of a snot. He's irresponsible, violent, and pervy. But we didn't see this part of him first. We instead saw him lose his life saving a child. We saw him as heroic and self-sacrificing. If we hadn't, we'd have been in the same boat as Botan, surprised that this guy, this asshole, would have done something like this. Subjectivity versus objectivity, viewing a person at their worst versus viewing a person at their best. That's what's at the core of this first episode, how different perspectives reflect reality in different ways. When Yusuke goes to his own wake, we revisit all of these characters from his flashback, only now both we, the audience, and Yusuke himself see them from a more objective standpoint. Keiko, Takanaka, his mother, they're all genuinely heartbroken. Yes, they had harsh words with him earlier, but that's because all three felt he was wasting his potential. They wanted to see him succeed. They all saw a chance for him to be great. And then there's Kuwabara, who genuinely does think Yusuke is great. He's not assaulting him because he hates him. He's assaulting him because he thinks Yusuke is the capital B best. And to be the best, you have to beat the best. For Yusuke, this is a revelation. The idea that there was a network of people who genuinely cared for him after all. Unfortunately, it's not as big of a revelation for the audience. I want to talk about this episode's one misstep for what it's trying to do, the one scene that really should have been cut. Let's rewind back to the flashback sequence. We just had the confrontation between Yusuke and Keiko, and we get a scene where Keiko talks about Yusuke with two of her friends. The other two girls are scared of Yusuke. He has a reputation as a bad guy, but Keiko shares a more positive perspective.
Besides, Yusuke couldn't order around 2 people, let alone 2,000. He doesn't have many friends.
I feel this was the wrong approach. First off, this is the only scene in this entire sequence where Yusuke isn't present, so this shouldn't be in his subjective flashback. He never knew this conversation happened. Second, this reveal that these characters actually care about Yusuke should be as much a surprise to us as it is to Yusuke, but this early scene tips that hand, shows us a calmer, more compassionate side to Keiko. It leaves the structure unbalanced. Not overly so, this scene is so short and uneventful that it's easy to forget, but the work would have otherwise been, in my opinion, perfect without it. The first episode of Yu Yu Hakusho is a short, brisk character piece told well, and the framing is the key to this. It's also not remotely reflective of where the series go. To give you some idea, imagine they made a sequel to It's a Wonderful Life, where Clarence approaches George Bailey and tells him that, with his experience visiting the alternate timeline where he'd never been born, George is uniquely equipped to track down time anomalies. And then a third movie where George Bailey fights a bunch of monsters in a tournament. And then a fourth movie where George Bailey fights a bunch of monsters in a tournament. Yeah, Yu Yu Hakusho is a weird beast that ends up completely different from where it started. But if you're looking for a decent way to pass 20 minutes, and you're in the mood for a well-told character drama, then I do recommend watching this first episode. Yu Yu Hakusho will return, and we'll see if there are other ways we can break this series down.